money is changing a lot of things here in Madison and certainly out in Washington. So I can't stress this enough. Disclosure, disclosure, disclosure. And the more we disclose, the less money we'll see.
Reformers of all stripes, including John, I think all thought that we were on a roll and that we would be able to take the next step, which is very important with regard to reform in Wisconsin, and that was to have a strong disclosure bill. At first we were seeking not just disclosure but also regulation so that corporations and unions would not be able to use their general treasury money by running these so-called phony issue ads, which you've been seeing for years on television, which are really campaign ads, but because they avoided a couple of magic words like vote for or defeat, we're able to escape regulation and disclosure. And so historically, on January 19th, the state Senate, with Senator Kreitlow and Senator Erpenbach leading the way, and a few Republican senators, Senator Michael Ellis and some others, passed overwhelmingly a very strong disclosure and regulation bill in Wisconsin. And we thought we were well on the way to significant reform. And then, of course, you all may recall that 2 days later, the United States Supreme Court handed down what many have considered one of the worst decisions the Supreme Court of the United States has ever rendered. Some have compared it even to as bad as the Dred Scott decision. And that was the decision that allows corporations and unions, but really corporations, to be able to use undisclosed, unregulated funds from their general treasuries. This was a decision that actually overturned 100 years of precedent dating back to the 1907 Tillman Act, and in Wisconsin to 1906 when La Follette and the reformers in this state made it so that corporations would not be able to influence elections. And now the coffers are wide open. The question for us is going to be whether or not corporations will use their general treasury money and try to buy not only national elections but state elections. The jury's out as to how that's going to work. But one thing that's critical and that we desperately need is strong disclosure, because what we need to have happen is we need to know that if a corporation is going to spend the kind of money that they're now able to spend, that you and I and everybody else know that they are behind the kinds of attack ads primarily, or the kinds of supportive ads for their hand-picked candidates, so that we'll be able to render a decision based on who is funding these. And the reason we need to have strong disclosure, and the reason we need to have the Wisconsin legislature pass something very strong, is because it's not going to be enough to have the Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce or some group say, well, yes, we can disclose where the money came from. It came from these corporations, or it came from a couple of these individuals. We need to know who's behind the money so that those corporations will know that the public's watching them and knowing where that funding's coming from. We didn't get that done in Wisconsin. Senator Erpenbach had legislation in the last month, and we worked within the last couple of weeks. It was ready to go, and inexplicably, well, it's not inexplicable, but what happened was the Assembly leadership did not take up John's disclosure bill and did not pass it. And so as a result of that, we do not have the kind of disclosure that we need in Wisconsin. The Government Accountability Board has promulgated a rule that requires disclosure, and that I think may go into effect, but it doesn't have the level of disclosure, or there are some experts who think it doesn't have the level of disclosure that we really need. And the other problem is that it's an administrative rule, and there are some anti-reform attorneys who intend to attack that, saying that only the legislature has the power to actually pass and enact into law the kind of disclosure that we're seeking. and that an administrative law won't be strong enough. So we've called for the governor to call a special session of the legislature to come back and pass John's law. The legislature could do it in 10 minutes. The votes are there. The votes are in the Senate, the votes are in the Assembly. It just requires action on the part of the legislative leadership to make this happen. No, you're second.
Okay, well, I agree with pretty much everybody up here. Any questions? Jay hit it on the head with the legislature. We fell short in campaign finance reform this year. I say this year because it's going to come back again next year, and we'll keep coming back until we get it right. We did pass the Senate. The disclosure bill, excuse me, passed the Senate, and it was a pretty strict bill. 24-hour reporting requirements if anybody's going to get involved in the campaign, and that's fine with me. I'd much rather not see corporations there, but constitutionally, apparently, legally, they can be now. So at the very least, they should have to disclose like everybody else does. I've always advocated for that. A level playing field, there's nothing wrong with that. Right now, it's not a level playing field. And the person really left out in the cold is the person who puts their name on the ballot. They lose their campaign. Their campaigns are hijacked by all sorts of groups. And in my case, when I first ran, and in many cases on this next election cycle, the candidates actually didn't come in last place in spending when you track all the money, if you can track all the money. The Government Accountability Board did come out with a rule. I think it's a good rule. They could have gone further, but I still think this rule is going to end up in court. There are groups out there on both sides of the aisle, both Democrat-leaning groups, Republican-leaning groups, and groups I've never heard of before in my life, and was born and raised in Middleton. But they are groups from outside of this state, outside of the Midwest, coming in and dumping a lot of money on elections. And they'll have to, report, ideally, but those are the groups that are going to take the Government Accountability Board to court, which is too bad. These are our elections. I mean, they belong to you and I. And granted, the groups represent a group of people, but usually it's a group of people that are very narrow and focused with a tremendous amount of money. And they say they may care about the candidate, but they care about the issue, period, and they will do whatever it takes to protect their back pockets. That's why they're there. So we could have gotten much further on campaign finance reform and the disclosure bill. We were working really hard right up to the end of session to try and get this done. I know Jay was in the office a few times to the point where I really kind of didn't want to see him anymore. But he's still there. And it came down to basically a matter of words that we couldn't necessarily agree on in the end. And in the end, session ran out, which again, it's too bad. This issue is not going to go away. The last time we really reformed the campaign finance laws, I believe, was 75? 70?
40 Shriver, yeah, 77.
Okay, so that was a little while ago. And our current laws, we've nickeled and dimed here and there in the edges, but our current laws really need to be changed to reflect the time. We're talking about millions of dollars being poured into this state. TV stations like it because it's ad revenue. But when you do have state senate races that will top $3 million in all likelihood, state senate races, state assembly races certainly going to top $1 million when all is said and done. And most of the money you don't know where it's coming from. You just simply don't. I would tend to think that if some of these groups were brought out into the light of day, some corporations probably would pull back their money because they wouldn't necessarily want to be associated with one side or the other. If they choose to do so, that's fine. But again, to me, it all starts with a level playing field. I think anybody and everybody should be able to participate in the process. And the process does involve money at times. But at the same time, they should have to disclose just like I do, just like my opponent does. We all have to disclose.